Good, yeah. Well, good afternoon, everybody present and everybody online. It's a pleasure to welcome my very old friend Adele Airoldi back to the school after 53 years or something like it. We were classmates in the class of 71. And I never imagined for a single second I'd be here all these decades later, but I'm sure Adele feels the same. Adele spent her career in Brussels with the European Commission. The Council of Ministers. Yes, very sorry. Excuse me. She graduated in Milan. Classics. Didn't you also do glottologia? Yes, glottologia, which I never heard of. Which is, I don't know whether it still exists. Glottologia. It's a science of languages, one of them things. And she started in Brussels as a translator. And then, that was in 1972, then administrator and secretary to the Council of Ministers. At the Council, she dealt with EU policies and research in the 1980s, the environment, chiefly environmental negotiators in 84 to 2000, in the latter years, health and consumer protection. In the meantime, she spent time at Cambridge at the Scott Polar Research Institute, and in 1994-95 she was EU Fellow in Residence at the Centre for International Affairs at Harvard University. Since retirement in 2004, Adele has been active on Arctic matters, both in the EU context and in cooperation with different institutions, writing on Arctic issues and taking part in conferences on the Arctic. She was one of the very first people to try to get the EU interested in the Arctic. She's worked with Green's reputation in Brussels, the Danish Polar Centre and Nordic Council of Ministers, where she was responsible for writing 3 detailed reports covering EU Arctic interaction until 2014. It's a pleasure to have you back in the Bologna Centre. Adele, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Where is
There, yeah, that's it.
Yeah. Yes.
No. That's it.
Okay. Sorry. In any case, I think the recent quite a lot of background noise, so you should be able to hear me. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure, of course, to be back here, and I hope that you know already about the Arctic. I've just done a quick reminder, as you could see with the first slide. It means I'm using the definition of the Arctic as north of the polar circle, which is the basic definition. And there are 8 circumpolar states. And in the Arctic, there are 4 million inhabitants, of which about 700,000 are EU citizens, which means they are citizens of Sweden and Finland. And I will say a few words about the cooperation in the Arctic as it is now. The Arctic Council is definitely the most important forum for cooperation, and it was created in 1996. But Arctic cooperation started for the goodwill of the Soviet Union. Gorbachev made a landmark speech in Murmansk in 1987, where it said that there was a need for the Arctic countries to cooperate, particularly on environmental sustainable development, and also to avoid the risk of nuclear militarization. After that, Finland, which was particularly interested because it shares a long border with the then Soviet Union, decided to launch a strategy for the sustainable development and environment. In 1996, it was Canada, which was quite interested in this circumpolar cooperation, who started initiating the Arctic Council. You could see how it is defined. It's not an international organization, it's an intergovernmental forum. It has been expanding, and by now it has 6 working groups. It has been able to create 3 legally binding agreements. You can see it on the slide: search and rescue, oil pollution, and scientific cooperation. And it has had an increasing number of observers. Now there are 13, including very important states like China and India. And there are also several EU countries which are observers. And of course, the UK is now a separate observer. But the EU never made it as an observer, and I will explain why a bit later. This was just to concentrate on which kind of cooperation you have in the Arctic. The EU became Arctic for the first time in 1973, when Denmark went into the EU and together brought Greenland, which was a part of Denmark, still is in any case. And this is also a very interesting sequence because Greenland had voted when there was a referendum not to get into the EU, but of course had to do what Denmark was doing. But in 1979, Greenland acquired home rule, and in 1982 decided to have a referendum in which the majority of people decided to exit the EU. And Greenland, very strangely, had a very good deal, much better than the UK had later on, because basically there was not much interest in the EU for Greenland, and there was interest in getting and maintaining good relations with Denmark. So the EU started. First, Greenland became an OCT, which means Overseas Country Territories. It was assimilated to an old colony, a former colony rather than old. There are many for France and the UK. And then the EU found out that it was very useful for them to keep some access to Greenlandic waters for fisheries. Therefore, the EU decided to give quite a lot of money to Greenland every year to have access to Greenland water, and also in part for sustainable development. And basically this grant went for education. Later on, Greenland became much more self-governing and more able to negotiate with the EU. And in 2023, there was a broader partnership. And just 1 week ago, Mrs. von der Leyen went to Greenland and to create a new office, a new EU office, and also to, with, let's say, great pomp, to show that the EU was able to give quite a lot of money again for the period of 2021 to 2027. And the interest of the EU is, one, to anchor Greenland to the EU, because and I talk about it later, Greenland looks west rather than to the EU. But the second reason was to have a partnership on raw materials. Of course, the EU lacks quite a lot of raw materials, the one which come mainly from China now. And while Greenland has quite a lot of mines. But I go back now to the beginnings of the cooperation. In 1993, there was the Barents Cooperation, which concerned all the Barents region, including quite a lot of Russia. It was already Russia then. And one of the entities which are part of the Barents cooperation, apart from Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and Russia, was the EU Commission, and it remained the EU Commission. It's a bit of a murky story because, in fact, the EU Commission was invited to take part, but it has never been a real actor of Barents cooperation, which was initiated particularly by Norway, which at that time was interested in good relations with Russia because of the fisheries problem. And the Barents cooperation has gone on until now. The EU has been financing a part of the cooperation, which was mainly, again, for sustainable development. But what is quite interesting, which I found out by chance, if you look at the website for the Barents cooperation, it doesn't even mention Russia, not even the historical part. Russia just went out after Ukraine because, or was expelled somehow, was considered status non gratus. I don't know what happened. But the real time when the EU became Arctic somehow was in the enlargement of 1995, when Sweden and Finland came into the EU. And in 1997, immediately Finland, which was particularly interested again in having good relations with the other Nordic countries and with Russia, initiated the northern dimension. You can see in the map, but it includes also again part of Russia. And also Iceland was a kind of party of it. And the northern dimension is going on still without Russia again. It's not very clear whether Russia went or whether it was expelled. It's a bit ambiguous, but the EU decided that they didn't want to have any relations for the moment, while Russia was at war with Ukraine. And the northern dimension was a way in which Finland wanted to anchor the EU. And in fact, now it's not Finland, it's the EU, which is a party. And quite a lot of money has been spent by the EU in the framework of regional cooperation. There is, by the way, the Arctic gets in because there is an Arctic window in the northern dimension, which was wanted very much by Denmark, since because of Greenland. In 2002, the Arctic window was inaugurated. And it continued to be there, although not in a prominent way. The northern dimension works by way of partnerships, and by now there are the first partnership was in environment, again because of the fear of Finland that what was happening in Russia, particularly in Murmansk, would create quite a lot of pollution, nuclear pollution. In particular, at the time, Russia was in a sorry state, particularly in the north, and many of the bases had been abandoned or were completely obsolete. So this was the first partnership. Then there was a partnership on sustainable development. Then there was a partnership on health. And the last one is a partnership on culture. In any way, the Northern Dimension has been going on with its own impetus, and the EU has given money continuously, and it continues even now after Russia is out. But as regards really a conscious exercise of the EU to get, sorry. A conscious exercise of the EU to get into the Arctic, it goes back to 2008, when the High Representative and the Commission wrote a paper on climate change and international security. They found out that the Arctic was in risk of becoming a kind of a hot spot for a potential conflict over resources and new trading routes. It was the time where climate change was opening up the waters, and Russia was starting to think to reopen the Northern Sea route, which goes north of Russia. And also the US had tried to go to the Northwest Passage. In any case, the High Representative of the Commission thought that it was time for the EU to say something about the situation and to start thinking about an EU Arctic policy. By the way, in May, there is a mistake, by the way, the circumpolar states which circumpolar of the ocean are 5 and not 6. I don't know how the 6 got in. People talk about the Arctic 5, had made a declaration which is even now recalled all the time, saying we don't need any interference. We are the master of the ocean. We are perfectly capable of dealing with it. So just stay away. And in spite of that, in October, the European Parliament had a resolution saying, yeah, it is time to deal with the Arctic, but it is important that the EU initiates an Arctic treaty on the model of the Antarctic Treaty. Of course, all hell broke loose at the time. There were protests from all the Arctic states. And in the end, in November, the EU prepared the first communication on the EU and the Arctic. You probably know how it works in the EU. There are communications which are more or less express the opinion of the Commission, and in this case, Commission and the High Representative for the ES. And then there are Council conclusions very often, which are adopted unanimously and represent what the states think about the communication. And then, of course, there are European Parliament resolutions which not necessarily respond to a communication. They can also be autonomous, and they are adopted by majority. And this pattern has been followed so far. There has never been a real act about the Arctic. But in the first communication, it was very, very soft. You could see protecting and preserving the Arctic in unison with the population, promoting sustainable use of resources, contributing to enhanced multilateral governance, which was promptly changed in the following communication in international cooperation, just to avoid any suspicion of an Arctic treaty. The second communication was more or less similar to the first one. The problem was that since the origin, those in the commission who were responsible for the Arctic policy were on one side the commission and the high representative, that is the External Action Service, and on the other side the DG Mare, which dealt with maritime affairs. And this was from the origin, because the first idea about a communication on the Arctic came from DG Mare. But this dichotomy has remained so far, and unfortunately it has been very, very difficult to have a really coordinated view. In 2016, there was a global strategic framework for foreign and security policy, and the Arctic was indicated an area where there could be a cooperation, a region where it would be possible to have a cooperation. In 2016, there was another communication yet, an integrated EU policy for the Arctic, where integrated is not very clear what it means, because it's not particularly integrated, but the Council in the conclusions has asked for a coherent and integrated, and so had the European Parliament. Unfortunately, it wasn't either coherent or not particularly integrated. And the priorities, as you see, are more or less the same, with a bit of a different wording, but there isn't much. And later on, we come to 2019, where the Commission changes. Von der Leyen Commission is a geopolitical commission, as von der Leyen said. So there were Council conclusions just before the next communication, and which said that the European Union would to ensure that its policy approach would take account of the relevant developments that it means. And then the Parliament even had later on in 2021, sorry, this is the next communication, but had a very, very long resolution, which was, even for the European Parliament, was all over the place. There were 70 considerand and I don't know how many clauses. There was anything, but it was particularly asked on the new dangers which were coming from this political situation in the Arctic, the new assertiveness of China, the new assertiveness of Russia, which had restarted militarizing the Arctic. So there was a kind of red light, this is danger. So now we get to the last communication, which is stronger EU engagement for peaceful, sustainable, and prosperous. Okay, so far it goes. But then geopolitical is all over the place. I will just put some markers where you can read about the geopolitical importance. By the way, I don't know whether it's a mistake, but the responsibility was with a capital R. So this means probably something. And then there are the actions. And the actions are more or less the same, but there is again developing a strategic foresight on emerging security challenges. And then the second has a part which just had red lights going in many states, instead pushing for oil, coal and gas to stay on the ground, including in the Arctic regions, of course. The Commission thought that this communication was very much in tune with their green growth strategy. And so this was a part of it, and it was an action which had had been praised, but as you can imagine, it didn't go down very well, particularly in the States like Norway. Let's forget about Russia. And so we come now to a bit of a judgment, because the last communication starts with the sentence, the EU is in the Arctic. Is the EU here in the Arctic? And this becomes my assessment. The Arctic is an exclusive club. As I said, the EU applied for observer in 2008, was allowed to observe. In 2013, there was a vote and observers are accepted unanimously, and there was no unanimity because Canada was against that. What had happened? I don't know whether you heard about the baby seals problem, which is something which started in '82 and basically continues until now. The public opinion was outraged because seals were killed in a cruel way originally in Canada, and so there was a ban on the imports of seal skin or seal products. And the ban was first temporary, then was made final, and then the question resurfaced not only for baby seals, but for all seal skin products. And every time in Europe there was a terrible turmoil by several animal rights organizations. In the beginning, it was Greenpeace, then Greenpeace opted out because they realized that it was a problem for indigenous populations. But in any case, the thing has gone on and on until present times. I think for no other theme there have been so many articles in pro or against. But in any case, this was in 2013 was still a very serious issue, and so Canada voted not to have the EU in the Arctic Council. And so there was this strange formulation. The Council received the application positively, but deferred the final decision until the concerns of the members are resolved. And the EU could continue observing what was happening. Then, in the end, Canada gave up his objection, but then Russia started from 2014 having objections in the EU being an observer. And in a way, you can understand why. There are now 6 member states which are observers, and there is a fear in an organization like the Arctic Council that there would be a kind of collusion between the 6 states and the European Union. There was really a kind of mistrust which has existed in other fora. I dealt with, for instance, the Convention on Climate Change, and at the beginning there was the same problem. We don't want who is the EU. The time was why does the EU want to be here? We are afraid it is too powerful, doesn't have to get in. But of course, the Arctic Council is a different type of organization, much less important. But in any case, it was. The EU is still out and is still observing, is still cooperating in the working group, but observers, for instance, can only talk in the meetings when they are allowed, and after the states, the real members can talk. And then is visible also in the strategies, the Arctic strategy of the member states. Finland has always been the champion of the EU in the Arctic, and the first strategy, which is around 2000, before 2010 in any case, gave an enormous praise to the EU. The second a bit less, and the last one still less, because Finland realized that it was somehow more important to cooperate for its ends with the other Arctic states. The same happened with Sweden. Sweden was never very interested in the EU and the Arctic, but now even less. There have been two strategies. And then Denmark. Denmark was always interested particularly in Greenland and not particularly in the EU. And the first strategy, which was 2010-2020, just had a small bit on the EU. A second strategy, very interestingly, has not been done because Denmark was waiting for Greenland to approve its strategies, which has come out less than 1 month ago, and is Greenland's foreign security and defense policy, an Arctic strategy. As you can see, it's quite interesting because the subtitle is Nothing About Us Without Us, which has been more or less adopted by the other indigenous populations in the Arctic, particularly the Sami, because indigenous peoples are the other problem for the EU. There are not so many. I mean, just the Sami or the Lapps, or whatever it is. The territory encompasses the northern parts of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. There are, as I said, most are in Norway. But they are now talking about green colonialism, particularly after the last communication of the EU. And you may have heard about Greta Thunberg going and protesting with the Sami about, I don't know, windmills being put into the traditional pastures, or the possibility of the Sami to continue in the traditional way of living. And the Sami really in a way, get a lot for the EU by way of financing, but they still very suspicious, and they think that the EU should do more. For the moment, what the EU does is this Arctic Forum and Indigenous Peoples Dialogue, which strangely enough, DG Mare takes care of instead of the EEAS, and there is one foreseen, but as far as I know, they are not happy about it, and there is not much participation, and there is still quite a lot of bitterness. How is the situation changed now, by the way? It's very complicated because all the cooperation with Russia has more or less ceased, except for the Arctic Council. Norway had a particular interest in keeping at least some communication channels open. They have fishing agreements with Russia, and there is all this part of extraction of oil and gas, which is more or less adjacent. So this time, okay, I forgot to say that the presidency of the Arctic Council are rotating, and Ukraine happened when Russia had the presidency. And all of a sudden, there was nobody at the meetings, except China as an observer and maybe others. But when Norway took the helm, which was 2023, they started working in order to keep at least some cooperation, because it was very important, particularly from a scientific point of view, to have data for the half of the Arctic, which is Russian. And the scientists were particularly worried about this lack of communication, except on a very personal basis. And very recently, the Norwegians succeeded in having a general agreement by all the Arctic Council for work to resume at working party level, but only not in presence, just virtual, by virtual meetings. But it's already something, and Russia agreed to do that, because at some point there was a fear that Russia would also decide to abandon the Arctic Council. So this is the situation now. What is the EU doing at the moment? The EU is not doing much. There were no council conclusions on the last communication, because obviously the situation was considered a bit too difficult and too complicated, and the conclusions had to be adopted unanimously. So we are in a kind of limbo, and I don't know how it's going to go on. Also, because now the situation has changed in the sense that basically nearly all the circumpolar states are part of NATO. So this has modified the terms of the program. And talking about a Candid assessment, in the beginning, I had thought about calling this talk a relationship which is uneasy, unlikely, and unstable. Then I had a second thoughts about the unstable, but now I think we are still there. So
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So if you have any question.
So now, so there you see what happens when you're in the presence of a real expert. So who would like to fire off the first question?
Thank you very much for this talk. My name is Marian. I'm in a second year Maya student. My question relates to energy and the particular difficulties that the EU is facing with that currently. You mentioned before the Northern Route, if I'm not mistaken, is it called, that Russia was thinking of opening that up again, is using it now, I think.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, exactly. So how does that play into the EU's interest in the region? Because pipeline gas from Russia is not very feasible anymore. Now LNG has been transported via ships from Russia via the northern route towards ports in, I think, Western Europe. So how does that play into the equation?
What do you mean? It plays into it?
Into the EU's interest in the Arctic.
Yes, it is a problem, as you say. I think that this idea that oil and gas will remain in the Arctic, of course, doesn't apply to Russia anymore. It applies, and Norway will go on. And it's a difficult question. I think that the EU, I read quite recently, is planning to try to stop that also as far as possible. But it's very difficult for some of the EU countries. I think France gets quite a lot, and Belgium certainly is a hub where the the LNG is transported and there's still some coming from Russia. So it's a problem which will have to be faced by the EU, but it's very difficult for the moment. I can't make any forecast. And I think all these kind of things are explored, but the EU as such now has so many different views about this. And certainly this idea that everything should stay in the ground is still there as a kind of idea, but it has absolutely, in my view, no chance of being implemented somehow.
Thank you.
Thank you, Marion. Yes, please.
Hi, thank you for the conversation. My name is Helen and I'm a Master's in European Public Policy student. So I just had a question about the EU's observer status. Is that something that's recognized by other bodies, specifically adversaries like Russia or China? And then, assuming the answer is no, what can the EU do if Russia or China do step into some of these areas in which the EU has observer status?
But the EU does not have observer status in the Arctic Council. This is the point. It observes, but it has no official observer status because of Russia. As I said, and in any case, the Arctic Council is not an international organization. It's just a sui generis organization.
So how do they have any legitimacy?
They have a legitimacy that their members bestow upon them, and the observers recognize them. And there are quite a lot of international organizations which are observers. For instance, I don't know, the World Meteorological Organization, the UNEP, or the UNDP. And on the other hand, the World Wildlife Fund. It's a bit of a strange animal, the Arctic Council. But until now, it was a recognized actor in the Arctic, really. And the EU is there in a way, because it keeps observing from, let's say, a different status, just sitting last. They are the ones who can ask questions after all the others, and they can talk after all the others.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting dynamic.
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
That's an observation more than anything. I think the issue of international organization, I think, is interesting because, of course, the Arctic Council is not based on an international treaty. Exactly. So this, I think, it's important to understand what we mean in terms of the broad and more specific concept of an international organization. And then just another observation is that the timing of Canada's sort of veto on EU observer status kind of coincides with the beginning of Canada and EU's negotiations. Exactly, with CETA. And I wondered whether you had anything to add to that, because of course that was a very complicated negotiation.
Also, ostensibly, Canada did that because of the SEALS ban, and at that time, Canada went to WTO. And strangely enough, WTO said that Canada was right, and it was absolutely right to prohibit the trade of sealskins on the basis of cruelty, which was something nobody expected.
Yeah.
And not only, but the EU had negotiated with Canada and Greenland as well, an indigenous exception, saying that if sealskins went from a traditional hunt of indigenous, they could be sold And the WTO said that no way, there is the indigenous exception cannot exist, is not legitimate according to us. So it was a very strange situation. And by the way, from a practical point of view, let's say the trade in sealskin had died a long time before. It was just a matter of principles. You don't see any seal fur going around, and there is still the possibility in Greenland to sell small trinkets made of sealskin, but it's not important. It was just, as you said, a matter of principle to be put in a broader context.
Thank you.
And anybody else? Can I ask a question about this book?
Yes, it's not a book.
What
yeah.
is it?
Well, it's the Greenland Arctic strategy. Greenland has become much more assertive in this.
Is it a fully independent nation state?
No, it's not a fully independent nation state, but it has, let's say, Denmark remains competent for defense and for monetary matters and something else. But in any case, Greenland is practically independent and it has control over its own resources. And what happened now is that Greenland is becoming much more assertive, also because they realized that they had quite a lot of strategic material. And in the past, China had tried to get in to mine, but it was prevented in many ways. But now in this, which they say, foreign security and defense policy, they said that we accept defense from Denmark, but we don't want any troops coming from other countries, other NATO countries. Second, we are looking west very much. We want to be friends with the US. We want to be friends with Canada. That's where our main interests are, where quite a lot of indigenous peoples we are related with are. So this is our priority. Of course, we are in the EU and we are very happy to be in the EU. I believe so because quite a big part of their budget comes from the EU. But it's not their priority. There has always been a bit of a distance between Greenland and the EU.
Thank you.
But it's an interesting document. It's very short. It's a lot of pictures and not much text. But on the other hand, as I said, it's very significant that Denmark refrained from having an Arctic strategy, waiting for what Greenland would say.
Another country which you've never mentioned is Iceland.
Yeah. First of all,
Iceland is always held off from the EU.
well,
How do they stand in the middle of these questions?
to start with, Iceland is circumpolar in this geographical sense, just because it has a tiny bit which is above the Arctic Circle. And for the rest, climate, etc. I mean, Iceland is a case apart. And it has many more relations with Denmark. And it's true that it doesn't appear much. It's part of some of this northern, let's say, alliance, etc. But there has been an Icelandic Arctic strategy a very long time ago. And now they are very active in having circumpolar meetings. There is a famous one which takes place in Reykjavik every year, and it has an enormous amount of participants. Also, I should say, because Iceland is rich and can offer a lot from that point. I've been to one of the first, and my God, I've never been treated so well. That's, so I haven't found anything lately on Iceland.
Thank you. They had a referendum on the EU, didn't they?
Yes.
Rejected EU membership.
Iceland, no.
I don't think they had the referendum, but they were thinking about
Yes.
joining, and then when they had the financial crisis.
Yeah,
And then.
then
and
I don't think
withdrew
they
there.
ever had a referendum.
Yeah.
The question is always fish, isn't it?
Yes.
It's always fishy.
By the way, with climate change, fish is moving a lot, and it has been in the past. For instance, Greenland kept having quite a lot of money from the EU for access to fish, which at some point was non-existent. I remember it was said just a bit laughing by Greenlanders, saying, haha, we continue, they continue to behave as if they can have a lot of fish in our waters, but not now. Fish moves. And I think one of these moves is taking place now. On the other hand, Greenland is very important strategically now, because there is this famous, I don't know how it's to pronounce it, Duke Gap, which is between Greenland, Iceland and the UK, which is the passage for all the ships which are coming from Russia, going into the Atlantic. So there is Greenland is becoming strategically important again.
Fine, thank you.
David, can I just ask, I just have a curiosity. What's the relationship between the Arctic Council and the Nordic Council?
No, the Nordic Council is a completely different thing.
Do they have any?
No, they do have a relationship, but the Nordic Council involves the Nordic,
Sure.
the Nordic European countries.
Sure, but I was wondering whether the.
No, they have a relationship, but they also go a bit more south than the Arctic Council as a territory, which is important. By the way, I wrote what I wrote on the Arctic. I wrote for the Nordic Council, and they were interested at some point, and it was before the EU started being interested in the Arctic. So they just wanted to know what the EU was doing, and nobody knew. By the way, if you are interested in this kind of things, forget the websites of the EU. They are really very bad. They are not, no, seriously, they are not kept up to date. And of course, it's not something which is very important. By the way, by now there is a kind of EU envoy, the second or third, but I've noticed there are mistakes sometimes. I don't blame them, because there are many more important things to be taken care of at the moment. But the best website is the one of the Arctic Institute in Rovaniemi. They have done a lot, and a lot of
That's in Finland.
research, yes, in Finland. And they are really very good, and they investigate every look and not look and find the word of what is happening. And second, if you want also an independent but a very informed and very interesting view, there are two authors which I even have put it here. Last ones, Andreas Raspotnik and Adam Stepien, and they've been writing mainly on these communications, etc. And I've known, yes, they call them Arctic, of course, it's not my family. But in any case, they are worth reading if you are interested, because they analyze everything, and I agree with them normally.
Good.
Something happens.
So anyone asking questions online?
Good. Well, I think that was a splendid talk and a fascinating discussion. It's something none of us ever thought about seriously.
Yeah.
And never even thought about thinking about. You came along. Thank you very much. Indeed. Thank you.
Thank you.
Slide in one way or the other. Yeah. Thank you, that would be great.
Yeah, I will.
I put you on the website, okay, fine.
Together with the recording.
Perfect, thank you.
Anything.
Or, yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Brilliant.